Good morning to this, what I hope will be a beautiful spring day, maybe a little rainy, but without rain you can't have flowers and other lovely things. So welcome to the King Institute for Faith and Culture. I'm honored today to welcome my friend Anthony S. Abbott, whom I call Tony. I think that'd be all right if you called him Professor Tony. And I can tell you a lot about his accolades. He is the Charles A. Dana Professor Emeritus of English at Davidson College, where he served as the department chair from 1989 to 1996. He is the author of novels and poetry, as well as critical studies, including the Pulitzer-nominated The Girl in the Yellow Raincoat. He has won numerous awards for his work and an Irene Blair Honeycutt Award for Lifetime Achievement in the Arts. He currently lives in Davidson, North Carolina with his wife Susan, and this evening he'll be doing a reading out of the Angel Dialogues, and I'll be helping him. So if you want to come and see me stutter through some poetry tonight, that's for the taking. But I want to also read just a few excerpts of his poetry, because the things that are on the page of like a curriculum vitae for someone are very different from the heart and soul of someone. Tony has suffered through incredible tragedy, and he's used that pain and his faith to create indelible works of art that move us on a deep level. And at some point, isn't that kind of the goal of life, to create something beautiful and sustaining through our faith? So I just want to read a few lines of his poetry to you today, because he's actually going to speak about Marilynne Robinson, a speaker whom we have had at the King Institute when it was called the Beekner Institute. Her voice is like the evening star after sunset. It holds the night. Time is death walking. We don't really know much of anything about God, and God doesn't like that. God wants us to know Him, and once we know Him, we will love Him. Give the cracked cup of your heart to those who need you. Bless the sun and the swift flying birds and the crescent of the new moon. And I'll just end with a few lines from one of my favorite poems from Tony. If words can save us, and they can, my darling, I would whisper in the chambers of your ears every wistful sound, like the warblings of the wood thrush, until, my wren, even the small boys whose voices are like angels would cry for more, and you, my swan, would sigh like the sun setting behind the ocean floor. Please join me in welcoming Tony Abbott today.
Thank you, Shannon. My latest book of poems is called The Angel Dialogues, which she held up. There was a poet who was very frustrated and unhappy and was unable to write, and he prayed for a muse, and instead of a muse, he got this really wacky angel named Shannon Harris, who is going to read the part of the angel tonight, and I will read the part of the poet. So I urge you to come, especially if you don't like poetry. Come, because this is not like poetry that you don't like. This is very accessible, and there's a lot of fun in it, as well as, I hope, some wisdom. I want to talk today about Marilynne Robinson, who may be our greatest living American novelist. How many of you have read Gilead? Interesting. Look, a few in the front row among the students. So my thought was you probably haven't read anything by Marilynne Robinson. She wrote a trilogy, 3 books, Gilead, Home, and Lila. all published during the first part of the 21st century. Here are some things that people have said about her. Marilynne Robinson writes masterpieces. Her work is astonishing, lucid, threaded with life's significant questions, and a quiet, intelligent grace. A luminous, profound, and moving piece of writing. There is no contemporary American novelist whose work I would rather read. So serenely beautiful and written in a prose so gravely measured and thoughtful that one feels touched with grace just to read it. Incandescent, magnificent, a literary miracle. Beautiful work, demanding, grave, and lucid. Robinson's words have a spiritual force that's very rare in contemporary fiction. And I read all this and I thought to myself, I can't say here what I thought to myself. I thought to myself, holy blank, 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 blank. And because I had read Gilead, and I couldn't finish it. I thought it was the most boring book I'd ever read. And all my friends said to me, you got to read Gilead, you got to read Gilead, you got to read Gilead. And I said, okay, I'll read Gilead. And I started reading it, and what happens in Gilead, I thought, was that nothing happens. I read 100 pages and nothing had happened. And by the time I got to I'd never finished it. I said, nothing happens. And then I started reading all this critical acclaim. And then she wrote Home, and then she wrote Lila. And I suddenly realized we have a major American novelist who I had not tried to read. And it's my obligation as an intelligent, thoughtful, sensitive writer to read our most important contemporary novelist. If not our most important contemporary novelist, clearly our most important contemporary religious novelist. She's a remarkable person. So I read Gilead, and then I read Home, and then I read Lila, and I realized I was totally wrong. Everything happens in this book. But it just doesn't show on the surface. You got to be a good reader, and you got to notice that underneath this surface where nothing seems to happen, lives are being profoundly changed. So, here I am to talk to you I want to do a little introduction to Marilynne Robinson and urge you to do your own reading. I have a 4-lecture series. An introductory lecture, which I'm giving you, and then 3 lectures, 1 on each of the books. So if you want me to lecture on the books, you gotta come back. I lectured on Gilead to one group, and at the end of the lecture, somebody came up to me and said, I think you and I were reading 2 different books. So we were. She was reading the book that I read the first time when I couldn't finish it. And I had to persuade her that something terribly important is going on in these books. Marilynne Robinson. She was born November 26, 1943 in Sand Point, Idaho. She says, my family was pious and Presbyterian, mainly because my grandfather was pious and Presbyterian. But it was more of an inherited intuition than an actual fact. We would talk more politics than anything else at the dinner table, and they were very Republican politics, I need hardly say. It's so interesting. So she grew up in a very traditional Republican family. Grace was not said growing up. I was brought up in a household where I was aware of having a certain kind of identity, which was Presbyterian. I teach at a Presbyterian college, so I understand this and what it means. You certainly understand what that means. The world by itself is very powerful. There was an implicit ethic that I felt. If anybody had asked if I had a religious upbringing, I would have said yes. And yet, in any sense of having any experience with religious experience was, until college, random. When I was a little kid, I was oddly inclined to faint. I mean, conk out. It's one of my earliest memories. My father had gone hunting with his father, and I came out to the barn, and my father had hung up a deer in the barn and was skinning it. I passed out, dead. I could not process this. He never hunted again. I think that's wonderful. He never hunted because he knew how horrified she was by seeing this deer hung up and being skinned. Her brother is David Summers. He's a noted scholar of Renaissance art. He painted as a child. She dedicated her book of essays, which is called When I Was a Child, I Read Books. You don't need the handout yet, but you will. That's one of the handouts from this book. And she dedicated, and she called him the first and best of my teachers. He told her she could be anything. Why not a poet? It was my brother, she said, who told me I should be a poet. So she started writing poetry as a child. She said, my mother would come in and change the sheets, and all this poetry would fall out. It wasn't anything against my mother or any potential reader. It's just that there's something about me that wants to be secretive until I feel that something is done. I love that. She had all these poems she wrote and she hid in her bed. As a little girl, growing up in Sandpoint, Idaho, she spent much of her time exploring in the woods around her grandparents' ranch. She said, I think that practically anybody who spent time in the woods by herself or himself has had some very strong feelings of being seen, you know, by a perceiver. She sensed the presence of the divine in the woods, so though her Presbyterian upbringing was mainly ethical in terms of work values and not in terms of spirituality, she felt that sense of spirituality in the woods around her house. She left Idaho, went to Pembroke College. Pembroke College is now part of Brown University, just as Radcliffe College is now part of Harvard University. She said, we women enjoyed exactly the same rigorous and ambitious education that the men did. She received her BA magna cum laude in 1966. She got a PhD at the University of Washington in 1977, and she did a thesis on Shakespeare. She taught at a number of Eastern schools. She said, I went to college in New England, and I've lived in Massachusetts for 20 years, and I find that the hardest work in the world, in fact, it may be impossible, is to persuade Easterners that growing up in the West is not intellectually crippling. On learning that I am from Idaho, people have not infrequently said, then how were you able to write a book? Once or twice when I felt cynical or lazy, I have replied, I went to Brown, thinking that might appease them, only to be asked, how did you manage to get into Brown? In 1980, she wrote a novel called Housekeeping. It won the Hemingway Pen Award for the best first novel. And then she went for 24 years before she published Gilead. She wasn't in a hurry. And then she published Gilead 2004, which won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. She published Home in 2008. She published Lila in 2014, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award. Those are the books that has made her famous. In 2012, she published When I Was a Child, I Read Books, a collection of essays. And in 2015, she published her most important collection of essays called The Givenness of Things, 2015. Very, very, very important essays. And I'm going to talk to you about these essays in just a minute. She says, years ago, I accepted a grant from the American Academy that was supposed to support me for 5 years without teaching. I lasted about a year and a half before I nearly went crazy. Teaching is a distraction and a burden, but it's also an incredible stimulus. When you're trying to work on something and it's not going anywhere, you can go to school and there's a 2.5-hour block of time in which you can accomplish something. She loves teaching. She moved in 1989 to Iowa City to teach at the Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa, the most important writing program in the United States. Her students adore her. She's a remarkable teacher, and she is extraordinarily well-read. She's been married, divorced. She has 2 adult sons to whom she is close. A photo of her granddaughter sits on the living room mantel adjoining a pop-up Christmas card from the Obama White House, where last year, 2012, this article was written in 2012, she received the National Humanities Medal from President Obama. He said to her that day, "Your writings have fundamentally changed me. I think for the better, Marilyn. I believe that." And he honored her, and he had a free day in September of 2015 when he was in Des Moines, Iowa. And he wanted to talk to somebody. So he called Marilyn Robinson, and they had a conversation on September 24th, 2015. And it was published in 2 parts in the New York Review of Books in November of 2015. A conversation between President Obama and Marilyn Robinson about the nature of democracy. Very, very important. She's a member of the Congregational United Church of Christ in Iowa City, where she sometimes gives sermons. The minister says that when Marilyn preaches, we have a larger crowd. The only 2 writers I know who preach, and both of whom get very large crowds, one is Marilyn Robinson, the other is Anne Lamott. Anne Lamott preaches at her little church in Marin City, just north of San Francisco. So if you're ever in Iowa City, check out the Congregational United Church of Christ. 2013, she turned 70. I'd like to read this. "In a month, I will be 70. I recognize the privilege of living in an age and a culture where this is not a significant attainment. I have the whole cohort of my friends around me, but something surprising has happened, some ticking upward of pleasure and intensity that is really not what I had been led to expect. My pleasures are the same, books and plays, church and teaching. And my feelings about them are changed only in degree. I thought these fevers ended with adolescence, and here they are back again and raging. This time I know my life is drawing to an end. The strangeness of life on earth, first of all, and then of everything that takes my attention, is very moving to me now. It feels freshly seen, like a morning that is exceptional only for the atmosphere it has of utter, unimpeachable newness. Sometimes I am so struck by an image or an idea that I cannot sleep nights." So at age 70, she is very, very, very much alive. I want to spend the rest of this lecture working with you on your handouts. And I have an apology to make, but it's also a confession. If you look at your handouts, you've got 2 handouts. One is from The Givenness of Things, these essays, and the other is from when I was a child, I read books. So what I did, I read both of these books. Then I underlined all the parts that I liked the best. And then I typed up on your handouts my favorite passages from each book. So what you have is in order of page numbers. Notice your handout, you'll see the page number in parentheses at the beginning, right? So if I say, given this page 230, you just go to the handout on givenness and go to page 230. If I say child 20, you go to child 20. Does that make sense? Now here's the problem. it doesn't make any sense to go through those in the order of the pages. Why not? Because when I finished typing up all that stuff with all the typos and everything else, I typed and typed and typed on my word processor, printed them out, and I said, I can't use them like this because they don't do any good. What I have to do, I have to go through all these quotes and sort them out thematically. What I want to do is to say, what is the nature of Marilyn Robinson's theology? And I decided that her theology has 5 major points. I may not cover them all today because I've only got 20 minutes. So I resorted all the quotes by subject matter and theme, and then I cut them out and I pasted them on this sheet. So now I have the quotes by subject matter. So we're going to bounce around. But you understand, the next time, what I've got to do is get somebody to retype the whole thing for me thematically instead of by page numbers, and I haven't gotten that far yet. I'm still working on this. This is all new to me because I didn't know a thing about Marilyn Robinson really 3 years ago. I'm still learning. I'm 82 years old. I'm doing my best to stay alive and take Marilyn Robinson as a model. Okay, let's start with child number 163. I love this, and then we go rattle, 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 rattle. Child 163. Point number 1. Marilyn Robinson's theology is based on the absolute equality of all human beings as images of God. The absolute equality of all human beings as images of God. Child 163. What would be the non-religious equivalent for the assertion that individual rights are sacrosanct in every case? Every civilization, including this one, has always been able to reason its way to ignoring or denying the most minimal claims to justice in any form that deserves the name. The temptation is always present and powerful because the rationalizations are always ready to hand. One group is congenitally inferior, another is alien or shiftless, or they are enemies of the people or of the state, yet others are carriers of intellectual or spiritual contagion. What she's saying there is that this is absolutely wrong, that this is what people are saying. They're saying that one group is congenitally inferior, that another is alien or shiftless, or they are enemies of the people or the state, or they are characters of intellectual or spiritual contagion. She says this is absolutely and totally wrong. Jefferson makes the human person sacred, once by creation and again by endowment, and thereby sets individual rights outside the reach of rationalization. My point is that lacking the terms of religion, essential things cannot be said. That's the first and most basic point. We are all created equal by God, and therefore all of our voices are equally valuable and valid. No matter our race or gender or sexual preference or ethnic background or political background, she said the single most important point in our time is that we have to learn to listen to one another and to value and respect one another. Turn to Givenness, page 236. And then there'll be a 286. I'm going to do those two together, 236 and 286. She says, that's cool, I love it. I do believe we blaspheme when we wrong or offend another human being. And I understand that over the millennia, this continuous, often outrageous blaspheming has put a vast unspent stress on the order of things. But the other side of this same reality is the great fact that human beings are sacred things whom it is indeed blasphemy to wrong. She says, I have no problem with the word sin. I think it is one of our most brilliant evasions to have associated sin so strongly with sexuality that we can be coy about it, or narrowly obsessed with it, or we can dismiss it as a synonym for prudery, as we go on hating and reviling, as we go on grinding the faces of the poor. We alone among the animals can sin, one of our truly notable distinctions. We are absolutely equal, and the most basic form of sin is that we treat other people with less than full dignity. She says, I suppose I might have been expected to speak about grace more theologically. She always says grace is her basic subject, when it is perhaps the major term in my religious tradition. But by my lights I have spoken theologically, since everything depends on reverence for who we are and what we are, on the sacredness implicit in the human circumstance. We know how deeply we can injure one another by denying fairness. We know how profoundly we can impoverish ourselves by failing to find value in one another. We know that respect is a profound alleviation which we can offer and too often withhold. A theology of grace is a higher realism, an ethics of truth. Writers know this. I think what she's saying is our writers are our prophets today. Marilyn Monroe, I said, no, Marilyn Robinson is essentially a prophet. Essentially, she's saying this is the absolute core of her theology. The second point is that the Christian churches have in some way failed to do this. G, we're going to stay in G. I got 3 quotes from Givenness, starting on page 104. What's the problem with the churches? Christianity is stigmatized among the young as a redoubt of ignorance, an obstacle to the human aspiration of the civilization. The very generosity and idealism of young people is turning them away. I know this is not unique to America, but there appears to me to be a dynamic at work that is new for us, a polarization of the good on one side and the religious on the other. That's a terrible indictment, if that's true, which will be a catastrophe for American Christianity. It is for Christ to decide who the Christians are, who has in fact done the will of his Father. It is for Christ to decide. If the churches decide that we are the good people over here, and all these, what I've learned is that the largest single group of students at Davidson College is what's called the nuns. N-O-N-E-S. The ones who put, when they ask what is their religious denomination, put none. There are more nuns than anything else. And some of the nuns are organizing themselves spiritually outside the church to try to be Christians in the sense that they understand it. America, she says, number 124, is a Christian country. We are identified in the world at large with this religion because some of us espouse it not only publicly but vociferously. As a consequence, we carry a considerable responsibility for its good name in the world, though we seem not much inclined to consider the implications of this fact. If we did, some of us might think a little longer about associating the precious Lord with ignorance, intolerance, and belligerent nationalism. Associating the precious Lord with ignorance, intolerance, and belligerent nationalism. These few simple precautions would also make it more attractive to the growing numbers among our young people who have begun to reject it as ignorant, intolerant, and belligerently nationalistic, as they might reasonably conclude, that is, if they hear only the loudest voices. I defer to no one in my love for America and for Christianity. See what people say to her, if you say this, you're not American. If you say this, you're not Christian. She's saying, I am American, I am Christian, I have devoted my life to the study of both of them. I have tried to live up to my association with them, and I take seriously Jesus' teachings. In this case, he's saying that those who live by the sword will also die by the sword. Something called Christianity has become entangled in exactly the strain of nationalism that is militaristic, ready to spend away the lives of our young, and that can only understand dissent from its views as a threat or a defection. Point number 3. First point is the radical equality of all people. The second point is the failure of the Christian right to live the kind of Christianity that is implied by that equality. Her third point is that we should be liberal. What a dirty word, liberal. But listen to this. Child, page 65, 82, 83. I got 3 childs here in a row, so we're going to be in child for just a minute. But in Renaissance French, liberalité meant generous or generosity. To be liberal meant to be generous. You say, he's liberal with his money, it means that he's generous. And she says, maybe we should use the word liberal to mean generous. There is clearly a feeling abroad that God smiled on our beginnings and that we should return to them as we can. We would find a recurrent passionate insistence on bounty or liberality, mercy and liberality, on being kind and liberal and bountiful, and enjoying the great blessings God has promised to liberality to the poor. These phrases are all Edwards's. I think that's wonderful. How many of you have ever heard of Jonathan Edwards? Good. The greatest theologian in America of the, 17th century. Calvin says, here's Calvin. She says, I am a Calvinist. Calvin says, as God bestoweth his benefits upon us, let us beware that we acknowledge it toward him by doing good to our neighbors whom he offereth unto us. This is, we had to turn over the page. So as we neither exempt ourselves from their want, nor seclude them from our abundance, but gently make them partakers with us as folk that are linked together in an inseparable bond. And she says, from the depth of my heart, I say, Amen. The law of Moses, 102, puts liberation theology to shame in its passionate loyalty to the poor. Why do we not know this yet? In fact, the laws of Moses establish a highly coherent system for minimizing and alleviating poverty, a brilliant economics based in a religious ethic marked by nothing more strongly than an anxious solicitude for the well-being of the needy and the vulnerable. And I want to quote 2 examples that she uses all the time. One is from Exodus, chapter 23, verse 9. Do not, boy, is this ever relevant? Do not oppress an alien. You yourselves know how it feels to be aliens because you were aliens in Egypt. Just think about that. She said, look down on 106. Does the word stranger, the word alien, ever have a negative connotation in Scripture? No. Are the poor ever the object of anything less than God's loving solicitude? No. Deuteronomy, chapter 15, verse 7. If there is a poor man among your brothers in any of the towns of the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your poor brother. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend him whatever he needs. Give generously to him, and to do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in the land. You know, people have used that line from Deuteronomy as a sign that we shouldn't do anything because they say, well, the poor are always going to be with us, so what's the point of doing anything about it because they're always going to be here anyway? And that's not what it says. It says, the poor will always be with us, therefore I command you to be open-handed. The problem of poverty is not going to be solved except by our open-handedness toward your brothers and toward the poor and needy in your land. God, that's so important to Marilyn. Wow. She calls herself, let me just read the end of this statement because it's so important. Our page 106 from Given. Are the poor ever the object of anything less than God's loving solicitude? No. Do the politics of those who claim a special fealty to the Bible align themselves with its teaching in these matters? No, they do not. In contemporary America, certainly. Though I am not competent to judge in such matters, it would not surprise me at all to learn that in any ultimate reckoning, that those nuns, as they are called, for the box they check when asked their religion, are better Christians than the Christians. Which, if it's so, should be a cause of embarrassment to us. She says, I don't know what this is, must be Givenness, page 116. Is this the one? This is on Calvin. See if I got the right book. As I have said on many occasions. Is that it? I am a Calvinist. A bookish woman like myself with a long, quiet life behind her has few opportunities to shock, even scandalize, and that is a part of the appeal of making this claim, I admit, but a disappearingly small part. I really am a Calvinist, and one aspect of Calvin's thought that appeals to me mightily is the famous work ethic. I work more or less constantly. Leisure bores me to death. But, and this is the crucial thing, I have found my calling. Difficult as it is, my work is my pleasure and recreation. Calvin taught that all work was of equal dignity, and the one is called to a secular vocation, just as one might be called to a religious vocation. 2017. All the material that I've given you thus far is based on, I'm looking for this, I'm missing something, but I'm going to find it. Based on material that was written largely 2013, 2014, 2015. I said, well, I wonder what Marilyn Robinson would say today about the state of our nation after the election of President Trump. And I found out what she would say, and I won't read it to you because I can't. But I would like to read to you what she says we need to do. She says, we have a chance to find out how real and deep American democracy is. We have to live out the ethos of free speech, press, and assembly, of equal opportunity and equality before the law. The ethos that has been articulated in the best of American history has to be realized in what we say and do. We, the living, in Lincoln's phrase, we, the generations that happen to be sharing this moment with Donald Trump, are suddenly and with no special qualifications called on to take a decisive role in American history and world history. The values we hold have to be vividly alive in a time when we cannot count on government to protect them for us. If we cannot count on government to protect them for us, then we must be responsible citizens, responsible for seeing that democracy works and that every single human being is treated equally. If we are faithful to these values, we will not be anyone's enemy. We will not be another source of division. If we are loyal to justice and equality in our own lives and at our own cost, other generations will inherit through us an America to be loved and enjoyed. So I present to you Marilyn Robinson as a figure to be admired and a figure who challenges us to be our best selves. And I recommend her novels to you with great sincerity. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll read you some poems tonight.
Thank you all and have a great day. Be blessed.
I think they were surprised.
It's good. It's great.